One of my greatest weaknesses in life, I have a lot of them, but one of my greatest ones is I have an inability to use one of these. Anyone know what this is? Ladies in the room are like, I know what that is. Fellas in the room are like, I've never seen one. This is called an instruction manual, okay? And I have a tendency that when I put things together, I tend to throw this thing off to the side pretty early in the process. In fact, I was texting Kylie yesterday as I was kind of finishing up my notes, and I was like, hey, babe, I'm going to use this as an illustration. Can you find me an instruction manual from our house, and can you get it ready for me? I'm going to use it for the sermon tomorrow. And I was texting her last night, and this was her response to me. She said this. I said, hey, can you find an instruction manual for me? It doesn't really matter what it's for. Like a physical one, booklet style? Yes, ma'am. Needs to be for putting something together. Let me ask around the neighborhood. I'm pretty sure we throw those away, even if the project isn't complete. Said this will be in the sermon tomorrow. Thank you. Right? But I have a tendency to not use this thing. Right? I pick it up and I look for a second and I toss it off to the side. And because I have a tendency to do that, generally what happens in our house is I'll put something together, like the dresser in Trinity's room, or I'll put a picture on the wall, and it'll look good at first, you know. But after a while, it stops functioning the way that it's supposed to. The dresser in her room is all broken, and it doesn't really work anymore, and the drawers are falling off. If you were to look at the pictures behind the walls in our house, they look really good on the wall, but if you were to take them off, you would find all of these different holes there that don't really go to anything, and there's like 16 nails holding up one picture because I didn't use a leveler, and I just kind of got it all to work out together, you know? And so it looks okay at first, but over time it starts to fall apart. And so I'm usually left with three options when I haven't built things the way that they were designed to be built. I either have to deal with this dysfunction, and I just settle for, okay, like this isn't exactly right, but it's usable. I can work with this. Or I'll try to fix it on my own because the instruction manual is gone, and so now I'm trying to jerry-rig some things together, and I'm pulling random pieces from a toolbox that's not properly put together, and I'm trying to make it all work. Or I just get so fed up with the thing that I throw it away, and I'm like, I'm done with this. I don't know what to do with this anymore. I'm finished. And what's interesting is that for many of us, this is what we do with marriage. So maybe you went to a couple of premarital sessions before you said I do, and then you just started trying to figure it out on your own. And you tried to build it in the way that made the most sense to you, and you didn't really build it the way that God said to build it, but now there's this dysfunction, and it's not working the way that you think it should be working, but you're like, I mean, this is fine. It's better than my cousin's marriage, or it's better than my parents' marriage was, or it's better than my neighbor's marriage was, and so like, it's fine. It's not perfect, but we can just deal with the dysfunction. It's okay. Or you go through all these steps to try to fix it on your own, and you're spinning your wheels, you're putting in all this energy, all of this effort to try to make things better, but it feels like you're not really getting anywhere. And for some of us, we get to the point where because it's been so dysfunctional for so long and we've tried everything that we know to fix it, we just get to the point where we're like, I don't even know if this is worth it anymore. I'm ready to throw in the towel. I'm ready to be done. I'm ready to leave, and we throw it away. And I don't know what your experience is with your marriage this morning, but what I do know is that there is a way to have a marriage that functions. There is a way to fix it and not have to do it on your own. There is a way to get to the point where you don't have to throw in the towel. And so this morning we're going to be in Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 21. And what I want to give you this morning is what I'm calling the E5 marriage manual, the E5 marriage manual, the Ephesians 5 marriage manual, the way that God says to build a marriage so it does not fall apart. Now, a couple of disclaimers that are going to be important for this morning. Number one, if you're single or divorced in the room, I just want to be clear, this is still for you. This word is for you, one, because you may have a marriage in the future that you want to make sure you build the right way. But two, what you're going to learn as we study through the text is that the principles that Paul is going to give us as it relates to marriage are broader than just marriage. They can be applied in all of the relationships of our life. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So if you're single or divorced in the room, this message and this whole series is still for you. I would encourage you to lean in and to still show up every week. Number two, I just want to be honest that what we're going to read this morning may be a little bit controversial in 2025. There's some language in the passages that we're about to read that may be hard for some of us in the room, but I just want you to know what my commitment is as the pastor of this church. What we are not going to do is skip over texts in the Bible because they're hard to hear or difficult to understand. What we aren't going to do is ignore verses because we don't like them. What we aren't going to do is cherry pick the scriptures and only follow the ones that align with our positions. What we aren't going to do, hear me, is ignore God's word because somewhere along the way, someone decided to misinterpret, misuse, and abuse the text. We're not going to ignore things just because they're uncomfortable. What we are going to do is we're going to wrestle with the text. We're going to read it appropriately in its context. We're going to let the scripture speak, not what someone told us. We're going to trust that God knows what's best, even when we don't like it. And we are going to address hard conversations with grace, truth, and love so that we might hear from God and be changed by what he says. Hear me. Because our job, contrary to popular belief in the West, our job is not to open this up and just get in the text. Our job is to get under the text. And we like to judge it. We like to look at this thing and go, okay, like, do I agree with that? Does that work for me? Is that okay? Does it fit our context? It's not our job to judge the text. It's our job to let the text judge us. It's either authority or it's not. It's either the word of God or it's opinion. It's either advice or command. It's either that we follow it or we decide to be the judges of it. So we are going to be a people who get under the text because that's where blessing is found. That's where peace is found. That's where a life that pleases God is found. If you don't have an authority in your life, can I just suggest to you, you might not be following Jesus. Because if this never disagrees with you, you're not following God. You're following a God that's made in your image. There ought to be times that it confronts you. Hear me. There ought to be times that the scripture offends you so that you don't live offensive to God. Third disclaimer, final one. I just want to recognize that everyone in the room is coming in with their own background and experience. And the conversation we're having this morning requires nuance. It's not really meant to be a monologue, it's meant to be a dialogue. And so one of the things that happens in our Western church culture that was not an option for the early church, just so you know, is someone says something you don't like and you're like, that's cool, we'll just go to another church. And we'll find someone who tickles our ears or says the things that we want, or I disagree with the way that was said, and maybe we should process it together, but that would be way too complex. I'll just go somewhere else. I want to challenge us. If you consider home church your church and you're offended by something I preach, talk to me about it. Email me. Let's get together. Find a member of our staff. They'd love to process it with you. But let's be a people who live in biblical community and wrestle with the things of God together, knowing that we all have different stories and we have to bring our understanding to the text as we hear from God. Everyone with me on that? Great. With that said, let's go to Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 21. It says this: Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, a little context. Paul is writing this letter to a church in Ephesus. And he's writing this letter, and most scholars believe that this isn't just a letter that was written to a particular church. While it was written to the church in Ephesus, it's likely that this letter would have been traveled around to the surrounding churches. The church in Ephesus had kind of become a hub, an ascending place for a number of different churches. And so most scholars believe that this letter was written to this church, but it was meant to be traveled around. And Paul generally follows some movements in his letters. It usually looks like there's a greeting, and then there's some gratitude, and then there's some correction for some things that need to be fixed in the church, and then he tries to give them a theological understanding of who Jesus is and why they follow him and what it looks like, and then he gives them some application. In light of what you just learned, now go and do this. Now, what you'll notice in the book of Ephesians, or the letter to the church in Ephesus, is that it follows that same pattern minus the correction. That there's not a lot of correction that takes place in this book, because because of what's going on here is that Paul isn't trying to correct an issue. He's trying to teach Christians what it means to follow Christ. And so he's writing this letter to go take this to this church and this church and this church, and let's give a general roadmap of what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus. And so you'll notice if you read chapter 1 that he greets them. He calls them holy and faithful. And then he tells them that he's constantly praying for them and that he's thankful for them. In chapters 2 and 3, he explains how they've been made alive in Christ and they've been reconciled back into the family of God. And then in chapter 4, he gives us instructions. Hey, if you're a part of this family, this is how you ought to behave. This is how you ought to live. These are the rules of how to engage in this family. And where we find ourselves in chapter 5 is that Paul is then going to instruct us to take these kingdom principles that he's just given and teach us how to connect them to our own families. What does it look like to live out these kingdom principles in your day-to-day in your home? And he starts by saying, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, this word submit, it actually means to willfully yield. To willfully yield. It means to put yourself under something or someone. So he says to the church, submit to one another. Now, oftentimes when we read Ephesians 5, we immediately think he's talking about marriage, but just to set the context correctly, Paul isn't even talking about marriage yet. This submitting to one another is not about a husband or wife. This is about the whole church. He's going, hey, everyone, if you're a follower of Jesus, you're in this family, this multi-ethnic, multi-generational family of God. We all submit to one another. Now, what he's going to do in the rest of the chapter is he's going to lay out 3 different types of relationships where this submitting to one another is necessary. He's going to talk about marriage. He's going to talk about parenting. He's going to talk about work. We don't have time to cover all of them today, but I would submit to you that you should read all of Ephesians, and particularly this section in Ephesians 5, because you're going to see this idea of submission is much bigger than just a husband and wife conversation. It's a family of God conversation. So he says, submit to one another, and then he gives the reason for this submission. He says, out of reverence for Christ. Out of reverence for Christ. This word reverence is actually the word phobos, and that word phobos means the fear of the Lord. Submit to one another out of the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is not the idea of being afraid of God, but it actually carries the ideas of awe and appreciation and authority. It's kind of like when I was growing up and I would get really comfortable with my mom and I'd start making jokes or I'd say something, I'd go a little too far, and my mom would look at me and she'd go, boy, I'm not one of your little friends. And it was this moment where she goes, hey, we can be close. We can. But don't forget who I am. Don't lose your appreciation. Don't lose your awe. Don't lose the fact that I'm an authority in your life. And Paul says this is the way that we ought to view Christ. There is a closeness that is possible, but that closeness doesn't cause us to lose our reverence. Now, please note that Paul connects this idea of submission to Christ, and he connects this idea of reverence to Christ. That reverence and submission are both pointed towards Jesus. Essentially, Paul is saying this, is that Jesus is worthy of our reverence, that when we look at him, we should look at him with awe and appreciation and wonder and gratitude and recognize his authority in our life. But not only that, he says that Jesus is the reason for our submission to one another. That the way that we see Jesus should actually impact the interactions and the relationships that we have with each other. And the question that we should ask is why? Why is it that submission and reverence are tied to Christ? Well, the answer is really simple. It's the gospel. It's the good news of the gospel. This is what Paul writes in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. He says this, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as who? Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to advantage, but rather he made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant and being found in human likeness. And being found in the appearance of a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. What about the gospel should make you stand in awe of Jesus? The reality that Jesus is equal to God, and he chooses to submit himself to the Father in the Father's will, come down to the planet Earth, live the life that we could not live, die a death that we deserve in order to save us from our sin. That should make you look at God with awe and wonder. It should make you look at Jesus and go, I can't believe that. You're God. And you would submit yourself to the Father's will. You would humble yourself. You would make yourself less so that you could come to this world to save me. I hope and pray that we would be a church that never gets over the good news of the gospel. That if hearing the gospel is elementary to you, can I just tell you you've lost your way? Return to your first love. Don't lose the reality of who Jesus is and what he's done. He goes, when you get a glimpse of Jesus, it ought to create awe and wonder in you. And it should also create appreciation. Why? Because Jesus didn't just die for the sin of the world. He died for your sin and mine. For my brokenness, for my failure, for my mistakes, for my regret, for my bad decisions. Everything that I've ever done willfully and unwillfully against God, he died for and covered for me. That should fill my heart with gratitude. Reverence, awe, appreciation. Why do we have this reverence for God? Why do we have this reverence for Jesus? Because when we look at Jesus, we see this beautiful picture of submission and sacrifice. That he would submit himself to the Father and he would sacrifice himself for us. And then Paul says this, he goes, guys, when you consider your relationships with each other, remember the submission and sacrifice of Jesus. Because what he's done for you is what he's asking you to do for others. His submission and sacrifice is a picture of the way that we should interact with each other. Our relationships should be modeled after and known by our submission and sacrifice, because this is what Jesus has done for us. So if there was a marriage manual, the E5 marriage manual, I think this would be step 1. it would be to get a glimpse of Jesus. That both husband and wife would see Jesus, would be filled with awe and appreciation for who he is, would recognize the weight of the cross for their own lives, that you would get a glimpse of Jesus and feel the gratitude of a God who would submit himself to death, that you would feel the love and appreciation of a God who would sacrifice his life for you. That if you don't have a glimpse of Jesus, if you don't see him rightly, you cannot build a marriage that would honor God because you don't know what marriage is. Jesus calls the church his bride. And it's his bride that he submits to the will of the Father for. It's his bride that he sacrifices his life for. And so I might just submit to you in the room, if you don't have a clear view of Jesus, if you're not filled with awe and wonder and appreciation for who he is, maybe don't even listen to the rest of this sermon. Just go look at him. Just go fix your eyes on the cross this week. Just spend some time in the scriptures and the gospels and see the life and the love of Jesus and let it wreck your heart all over again. Because before you can figure out how to interact with each other, you first have to see what Jesus has done for you. Paul says, get a glimpse of Jesus. Because it's a reverence for him that leads to your submission to one another. And now, having talked about the submission and sacrifice of Jesus, he's going to take a turn and talk about what this looks like in a marriage. Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 22, he says this. He says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Now, in 2025, these verses get a lot of pushback, and I understand why. Because over the years, what has happened is unhealthy men have taken this passage and they've used it in a way to silence the voice of women, to demean the value of women, to be domineering and to put women in a place of being a subordinate in their marriage. And I just want to say, as your pastor, if that's your story in the room, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry that people have misused the scripture in that way. That is not God's intention for how this text ought to be used. And I can only imagine what the heart of the Father feels, because I can imagine what I would feel like if I watched one of my little girls in a relationship where their husband used the scriptures in order to minimize their value. It'd devastate me. And so as your pastor, I just want to say I'm sorry if this has been used inappropriately. And before I can even address what Paul is really saying here, I just want to boldly and clearly say what Paul is not saying. Here's what Paul is not saying. Paul is not saying that women are less than. He's not saying that women don't get to have an opinion. He's not saying that women can never challenge men or their husbands. He's not saying that women have no authority. He's not saying that women are weak. He's not saying women can't be used by God. He's not saying that women cannot be leaders. That is not what Paul is saying by any stretch of the imagination. And I can say this with clarity, boldness, and confidence. Anyone who says the opposite of that is not speaking on behalf of God. They're not. Because when you look at the story of Scripture, God uses women over and over and over again. And the strongest leader and follower of Jesus that I have ever known is my grandmother. And the most hardworking and best picture of Jesus that I know today is my wife. So I'm just telling you, what Paul is saying is not any of these things. But I do want to be clear about what Paul is saying in light of that. So let's look at the text again. He says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, there's our word again, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. What is Paul saying? Paul is saying that at the moment you became a Christian, you willfully yielded. Remember, that's what the word submit means. Willfully yielded yourself under Christ's leadership. That you put yourself under him. And putting yourself under Christ, it didn't make you less valuable. It didn't take away your dignity. It didn't take away your voice. No, your submission to Christ was a decision to trust him to cover you, to care for you, to have your best interests at heart, to protect you, to provide for you, and to lead you. And what Paul is saying is at the moment you said, I do, you made a decision. You are willfully yielding to your husband to lead. That leadership is to trust him, to cover you, to care for you, to have your best interests at heart, to protect you, to provide for you, and to lead you. And it is not making you less valuable. It is not taking away your dignity, and it does not take away your voice. Ladies, I want to be so incredibly clear with what I'm saying here. Paul is not asking you to have this type of relationship with every man. He says, each of you to your own husbands. This is not a relationship between every man and woman. This is a relationship between a husband and a wife. And so can I just submit to the single women in the room, if you can't trust his leadership, don't marry him. Don't marry him. If he's not a trustworthy leader, don't say I do, because there is a role that God is expecting the husband to play. And it's this, that the authority that he carries in the marriage, hear me, this is so important, is meant for him to lead his family in the way of the Lord, to lead them to make decisions that will honor and glorify God. That's with their finances, with their time, with their influence, and with their very lives. And with that authority comes great responsibility, which we're going to get to in a second. But I need you to hear what I'm saying. Please do not hear what I'm saying through the lens of culture. Hear the words that are coming out of my mouth. Leadership is not a dictatorship. And authority is not superiority. Hear me. There is a difference between leading the direction of your family through prayer, through conversation with your partner, through intention, and micromanaging every decision that they make. Huge difference. And the authority that God has given husbands is to set the direction or lead the direction of their family towards God. It is not to dictate every decision. Remember that God gave Adam the responsibility for his family to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Go back and read Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and you're going to find that God gives the command to Adam. It's his responsibility to make sure his family knows how to follow the way of the Lord. But he gives Adam and Eve, hear me, equal dominion over the earth. They both have authority. Adam and Eve are equal. They're just not equivalent. Submission, friends, is not weakness. Submission is not less than. And we're living in a culture that will say anyone who does this is weak. And can I just ask you a question? If that's true, what does that mean about Jesus? Is he weak? Is he less than? Does he have no value and no voice? Does he not say in the Garden of Gethsemane, Father, your will be done, but if there's another way, can we have a conversation about this? Does it make him passive? Does it make him less of a leader? Absolutely not. Submission to the Father does not mean weakness, and submission in a marriage does not mean weakness. No, submission is living out the humility of Christ. It's following Jesus. It's living a life that looks like him. And so step 2 of the E5 marriage manual would say this: wives, humbly submit. Humbly submit. Now, what does this look like practically? It means supporting, not demeaning. It means speaking well, not speaking ill. It means helping him in his weakness. It means building him up to be the man that God has called him to be. It means trusting his leadership. It means that in moments where you find yourself in a stalemate after much prayer and conversation and much wrestling, trusting that your husband will hear from the Lord to lead your family well. And it's deciding in the moments where he does wrong and he makes a mistake or he makes the wrong decision to give him space to learn and grow and to not hold his failure over his head. This is the picture of the wife's role in modeling the person of Christ in marriage. Now, I can't talk about this without thinking about 2020. I remember exactly where we were at. Kyla was in our front lawn with our identical twins who we had just gotten home from the hospital after not seeing them for 6 weeks. And I'd been praying and wrestling, and I felt like the Lord said to me that we were supposed to plant a church. And I came out to her in the front yard in the middle of a pandemic. She's wrestling with PTSD, having missed all of this time with our kids, and I tell her, and I think she's gonna look at me like I'm crazy. We have barely any money in the bank, but I'm like, I think we're supposed to put a deposit down on this wedding venue, and we're supposed to start this church. And she looks at me and she goes, I know. And I knew the moment that I married you. I trust you. And that was a beautiful moment, y'all, but what messes me up the most is that following that, money got tight and things were difficult. And I would meet with families during the day to talk about planning the church, and then afterwards I would drive Uber Eats at night and avoid Roswell so that nobody would run into me. And never once in that hard season did Kylie look at me and go, no, you were wrong. She never doubted me. She never gave up on me. She never doubted if I heard from the Lord. She was in it the whole way through. She had been by my side every single step of the way. And I need you to hear me. Nobody knows the weight that that woman carries. Nobody knows the sleepless nights. No one knows the weekends with kids by herself. No one knows the moments where someone calls with a crisis, and I look at her, and before I can even ask, she just says, go be with them. No one knows the moments where I've wanted to quit, and she has held me by my face and affirmed the calling over my life. I might have led us in this direction, y'all, but please hear me. Her submission in no way was weakness. It was bridled strength, and it was the humility of Christ for my benefit. And ladies in the room, I just need you to hear me when I say this, that when God looks at you, he does not see weakness. He sees bridled strength and the humility of Christ for the people around you. That's what he sees. Please, let's not let culture redefine what the biblical truth is for what a marriage should look like. Because our marriages are crumbling because we're following the way of the world instead of the way of Jesus. This is not weakness. This is Christ-likeness. And I hope we will all live by it. But that's not where it ends. Verse 25. Husbands, your turn now. Love your wives. Love your wives not by your own standard, not by your own preference, not by the way that feels comfortable to you. No. Love your wife just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing of the water with the word, to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. I've been reading this, and a couple of things have stood out to me. Before we even talk about what Paul said, I just want to look at the word count for a second. Paul says 54 words to the wives. He says 91 words to the husbands. It's almost double the word count. It's intentional. I'll tell you this. My greatest prayer in preparing this sermon is that the husbands in our church, the men of our church, would understand the weight and the responsibility of the role that the Lord has entrusted you with. And as I've read through this text, there are 3 words that have just been messing me up all week long. And the 3 words are this: just as Christ. That we are supposed to be a picture of Jesus to our family. That the way that we show up is supposed to remind them of Jesus. The way we love is supposed to remind them of Jesus. The way that we speak should remind them of Jesus. The way that we serve should remind them of Jesus. I can't speak for y'all, so I'll just speak for me. It's too often that I don't show up that way. That I don't model the love and the care and the grace and the patience and the goodness of Jesus in my home. And I want to be better about that. And men in our church, I want us to be better about that. So I just want to point out quickly 2 things that Paul says we ought to be just as Christ in. The first is this. He says, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Gave himself up for her. You see, where Paul calls the wife to this humble submission of Christ, he calls husbands to the sacrificial love of Christ, a love that will lay himself down and give himself up. Paul is literally saying, love your wife to death. Love your wife to death. Can I just ask you, husbands, what do you need to let die in order to love your wife well? Is it golf on the weekends? Is it drinking? Is it pride? Is it anger? Is it old habits? Is it friends? Is it social media? Is it lust? Is it your commitment to your sports team that's greater than your commitment to your family? Is it defensiveness? Is it stubbornness? I don't know what it is for you, but I can tell you this. Real love will always cost you something. Real love will always cost you something. And not only that, what's interesting is that the word that Paul uses for love is the word agape. It's a one-directional, unconditional love, which means that not only should love cost you, but that the sacrifice that we make for our spouse, for our wives, for our family, is not dependent on appreciation or reciprocation. And so often we want recognition for every single time that we sacrifice, but Paul goes, guys, no. No, this is the bare minimum. This is the way that Jesus loved you. That's the expectation. You don't get a gold medal. You don't get a prize. You don't get an award. You do what Jesus told you to do. This is how you love your wife, and this is how you model his sacrifice to us. You give freely with no expectation. Just as Christ gave himself up, you give yourself up as well. And then the second thing he says is this. Just as Christ gave himself up for her to make her holy. Jump down to the end. He says, after all, no one has ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does for the church. The second thing that he says is that the husband is to feed and care for his wife as if it's his own body. Now, this feeding and care for, in some senses, it speaks to provision, like financial provision and security and stability in the family. But I actually think what Paul is saying is so much bigger than that. I don't think he's saying, hey, husbands, you got to be the breadwinner or else you're failing. I don't think that's what he's saying. There is a provision that's necessary. There is a contributing to the family that's necessary, for sure. But I think what he's saying is bigger than just financial provision. And for husbands in the room, can I say this to you? Some of you have been convinced that your role is to provide financially, and so you aren't showing up in the ways that Jesus has called you to otherwise. I'm paying the bills, so we're good. No, we're not good. This is what Paul's calling us to. He's calling us to nourish and care for the souls of our wives. So can I just ask you, when was the last time you told your wife how much you appreciate her? When was the last time you complimented her? When was the last time that you prayed for her? Not just at a meal, but like you laid hands on your wife and you spoke blessing over her. When was the last time that you told her what you love about her? When was the last time that you gave her encouragement? When was the last time that you bought flowers just because? Not because you were in trouble. Not because it was an event or a holiday, but just because you love her. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and a pastor said something to me that really messed me up. He came in and he said, hey, you know, there are two questions every man needs to have answered in his life. He said the two questions are, am I loved? And do I have what it takes? And those two questions were convicting, but what he said next was even more convicting. He goes, am I loved and do I have what it takes? Two questions every man needs to have answered. But here's the danger for us men, especially for the married men in the room. If you do not go to God to give you the answer to those two questions, you will put a burden on your wife to answer them for you that she was never meant to carry. If you have not recognized you've been loved by the Father, you're a deeply loved son. If you haven't recognized that he has wired you and gifted you for plans and purposes that he has for you, and you are enough, you have what it takes. If you have not come to that understanding, you will put a burden on your wife to answer those questions for you, and she was never meant to carry that burden. And so you cannot nourish her soul because your own soul is unnourished. I wrote it this way, that you can't nourish her soul when your soul is malnourished. And so for some men in the room, could I just suggest to you that the best thing that you could do for your marriage is to go to counseling and let somebody help you see that you're loved and you have what it takes. For some of you, the best thing that you could do is in a couple of weeks, we're going to start Bible studies back for you to get in a community of men who follow Jesus. And every week, you show up honest and you let them remind you that you're loved and you have what it takes. You nourish and care for your own soul so that you don't need to take from her, but you can actually give to her what God intended for you to give. Step 3 in the marriage manual is husbands sacrificially love. Just as Christ, you show up for her. What does this look like practically? It looks like listening to your wife. It looks like valuing her opinions. It looks like acknowledging the areas, this is so big. It looks like acknowledging the areas that she is better at things than you are and trusting her leadership. It looks like speaking life over her. It looks like praying with and for her. It looks like considering her needs, speaking well of her, creating space for her to live out her calling, recognizing the weight of what she's carrying and lightening her load. It looks like dying to yourself. Now, let me just tell you where we get sideways on this thing. Anyone ever been to church and you heard a sermon and you were like, ooh, my boss needs to hear that, or my cousin needs to hear that, or my mother-in-law, she definitely needs to hear that. Anyone else ever been in that spot? You know? Have you ever considered the fact that someone in your family or a friend or a coworker of yours, if they were sitting in the sermon, might say, you need to hear that sermon? We always think a word is for someone else rather than recognizing that the word is for us. And the tendency with this text is that we would go to Ephesians 5 and we would go, that's the problem. Gerald, that's why it's not working. She won't submit. Gerald, this is the problem. I don't know what to do with him. He's not loving me like Jesus. Look, it's him, it's her, it's her. Here's the problem with that, is that when you look at the text and you see the word for them, you will convince yourself that you need to force them to do their part. And where this whole thing gets sideways is where husbands try to force their wife into submission, or where wives try to force their husband to love. I just need you to hear me so clearly that forced submission is abusive, and forced love is manipulative. You are not God. Stop trying to be. It's his job to make her submit. It's his job to make him love. It's your job to go, that word's for me. Am I living up to the standard that Christ has called me to? Am I loving well? And am I living submitted? Am I practicing the humility of Christ that is required from both of us? And y'all, this is such a big deal because not only does it impact our marriage, it impacts the way that the world sees Christ. This is what Paul says in verse 31. He says, for this reason, a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery. I'm talking about Christ in the church. The mystery here is not what. The mystery is how and why. Paul isn't saying that he's confused by the reality that marriage is a picture of Christ in the church. What he's saying is, I don't understand why or how it works, but God has chosen to use marriage as a picture of Jesus and his church. And that when we live in submission and sacrifice, the submission and sacrifice that he first modeled to us, it actually displays his glory to the world. Paul goes, guys, this is a big deal. Because if Jesus offered submission and sacrifice to us, when we offer it to each other, the world sees in our marriage Jesus. Now, that's a lot, y'all. We covered a lot and not a lot of time. Paul said a lot and not a lot of verses. And he recognizes that, and I recognize that. That's why I love what Paul does. He actually ends with a summary verse. He says this in verse 33. However, each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Husbands in the room, Paul goes, hey, everything I said, if you forget it all, can I say it in simple terms? Love your wife. Wives in the room, you forget everything I said, can I say it in simple terms? Respect your husband. He says all of this boils down to love and respect. About 6 years ago, I was introduced to a book that changed the way that I saw marriage forever. The book is called, it's gonna blow your mind, Love and Respect. And they introduce in this book 2 cycles. I'm gonna give you the whole book in like 30 seconds. You don't have to read it, I'm gonna give it to you right now. Here's what the whole book says. That there's this crazy cycle, that when the husband doesn't feel respected, he withholds love. When the wife doesn't feel love, she withholds respect. And the cycle just keeps going over and over and over again. He won't love me, I don't respect him. She doesn't respect me, I don't love her. And it keeps going and going and going and going. And so you settle for this dysfunction. You try to fix it, but you can't get out of the cycle. Eventually you get so tired that you just throw the whole thing away. He goes, this cycle is crazy. Doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome is insanity. You withhold love, you know she's gonna withhold respect. You withhold respect, you know he's gonna withhold love. So how do you break the cycle? He says this, you love regardless, and you respect regardless. He goes, when the wife is submitted to Christ and the husband is submitted to Christ, when we see his submission and sacrifice, it leads us to go, if you could do that for me, even when I didn't deserve it, I can do it for them, even though they don't deserve it. Respect them, even if they aren't respectable. Love them, even when they're hard to love. Now, I want to be very clear with what I'm saying here. I'm not speaking to serial cheating. I'm not speaking to abuse. I'm not speaking to a person who is not just not respectable, but who is ungodly and hurtful. That's not what I'm speaking to. I'm speaking to a marriage where you're struggling and neither of you are perfect and you've been in a cycle for a long time. What if you just decided that even though he's not being respectable, I'm going to respect him anyway? Even though she's really hard to love and she keeps cutting me down and we're not able to figure this thing out, I'm just gonna choose to love her anyway. Not because they deserve it, but because of what he's done for me. You see, the fourth step and the final step of the E5 marriage manual is to trade fairness for grace. Fairness is you get what you deserve. Grace is I'm going to give you something better than you deserve. You're not being respectable, I'll respect you anyway. You're hard to love, I'm going to love you anyway because of what Jesus has loved for you, because of Jesus' love and respect for me. My friend Pastor Evan Lowell says this, I love this line. He says, it's far better to be together than it is to be right. So could I suggest an exercise for us this week? Husbands in the room, what if you just decided to take some time this week and write out all of the things that you love about your wife and give it to her? See what it does for your marriage. Wives in the room, what if you decided this week to write out all of the things that you respect about your husband and give it to him? See what it does for your marriage. If you're single, you're not married in the room, you're divorced in the room, same exercise. What if you picked, ladies, a man in your life that you greatly respect? For some of you, this needs to be your dad. And he wasn't respectable, but you make a list of all the things you respect about him and you give it to him. Fellas in the room, maybe you do this for your mom. All the things I love about her, give it to her. I'm telling you, this exercise works, and here's why. Because submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ is not a marriage idea. It's following the way of Jesus. The Bible says so much about marriage. We're going to cover more over the next couple of weeks. But for today, so we're out of time, 4 things. Get a glimpse of Jesus. Wives humbly submit. Husbands sacrificially love. And both decide to trade fairness for grace. And here's the reason why. Is because when you get a glimpse of Jesus, you realize that these aren't just instructions for a healthy marriage. This is what Jesus has done for us. That he humbly submitted to the will of the Father. That in sacrificial love, he died a death on the cross. And that he would trade fairness, us getting what our deserve, which is hell and separation from God forever. He would trade that with his grace. And he would offer you life and love at his cost. This is the good news of the gospel. And this is the picture that our marriage is supposed to reflect to the world.